Moses on the mountain of God, and he sees God's presence in this burning bush. He can tell because it is a bush and it's not burnt up. There's something not right about this. And God speaks to him and says, "Take the sandals off of your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." And then he's explaining to Moses, all right, you're going to go save the people now. You're going to go save my people, your people. And this time it will work because I am with you. In verse 11 of Exodus chapter 3, "But Moses said to God, 'Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?'" See, he's worried because he's already tried and failed. So why me? And God's reply is not because anything else. The first thing he says is, "But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." And so then we see the promise being given to Moses. It's not about you, it's about me. And this is your sign that you're going to worship me here on this mountain. And so then the fulfillment of that is in Exodus chapter 19. We studied this recently. Exodus chapter 19. We see Moses has brought the people out of Egypt by God's hand, by 10 plagues, and then through the Red Sea. And then he's gone through and God has given them victories over the need for water, over the need for food, over the military victories. And now he's here, and yet again, there is a need to remind the people of God's great power. Again. So, beginning in Exodus chapter 19, beginning in verse 16. "On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up." So, they've come to this mountain, the mountain of God. And God, after telling them to consecrate themselves and setting a very clear border for how close they could get, gave them this incredible display of power. We see throughout the Bible, we're going to continue seeing, especially if you were to continue studying this, that lightning, thunder, and earthquakes, when used in combination, those three only come together when it is a sign of God's presence. It's used especially in Revelation. God reminds his people, though, of his power and might. There is a purpose to this demonstration. It's not just to remind them how great that he is, though. It's to remind them that he is to be feared, that they ought to be obeying him, that the complaining that they have been doing recently is not something that aligns with what his people should be doing. And then, after he's given them this demonstration, he immediately is going to start giving them the law. And he gives some of it directly to the people. He tells them, and the people are so afraid, they say, we can't have him speak to us. They're recognizing that barrier. They understand that there is a barrier between them and God. Much like Isaiah does when he sees God, and he says, woe is me, for I'm a man of unclean lips. A recognition of the barrier between them and God. God is on the mountain, and they are not. They have taken their stand at the foot of the mountain. Moses gets to go up on that mountain, and that's incredibly important. Moses gets to speak with God face to face. Moses has some barrier, as we studied in Exodus 33 and 34, but there is much less for him. Our goal then ought to be to become more like Moses, to become less like the people of Israel and more like Moses, to be up on God's mountain. God's told Israel earlier in the chapter what they could be. Look at Exodus chapter 19, beginning in verse 4. "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. A holy nation. The definition of holy is to be without sin, without blemish, to be pure, to be perfect. So then, God's power combined with his holiness means that they need to treat him as such, and then, if they do, they will become holy. That is the end goal for the law, was to make Israel holy. Unfortunately, the Israelites did not get this out of the demonstration of God's power. This is not what they got, because we are going to see as we continue in our Bible studies, going through Leviticus and Numbers, that they fail over and over and over again. And it starts with the priests in Leviticus 10. Nadab and Abihu offered a strange fire, one that was not among that which was given, the orders, the rule set by God, and for it, they were immediately killed. It's a lesson. And God says, before those who come before me, those who come to me, I will be treated as holy. It's an insistence. If you are to come to me, if you are to cross that barrier, you must treat me as holy. You must be holy yourself, is then the further assumption, because a holy, by definition, cannot be with that which is not holy. They do not mix in any way. For something that is holy to be with something unholy automatically makes the holy thing unholy. So then, this is the problem. This is the problem with man as a whole. A holy God, a powerful creator who we should want to be with, we cannot be with because he cannot be with that which is unholy. And therefore, in order for the people of God, in the place of God, in the presence of God to work, in order for God to be able to create that paradise, he must make his people holy again. His people must choose to be holy again. But, as we just said, Israel fails over and over and over again. And in 1 Kings 18, when we get there, they've been failing spectacularly for quite some time. And in 1 Kings chapter 18, if you'll turn with me there, we'll be in 1 Kings 18 and 19 for the next few minutes. 1 Kings 18, Ahab is reigning in Israel, and his wife, Jezebel in particular, but with Ahab's power, has turned Israel into a land of extreme idolatry where God is not even remotely thought of. They don't think about God anymore. And we see this because we have all of these prophets of Baal, all of these priests of Baal, and Elijah challenges them all, and it's just Elijah to speak for the Lord. But, nonetheless, beginning in verse 36 of chapter 18, and at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And from there, they slaughtered the prophets of Baal, and it's this great victory. At least, that was what would be what you would think. And yet, Jezebel and Ahab still reign. And in 1 Kings 19, this isn't enough for the entire people of Israel to turn around. Jezebel says that she's going to make his life as one of them, meaning the prophets of Baal. She is going to kill him by that day, by the end of the day. And so he runs, and he leaves his servant behind. He goes about out, and he just wants to die. He's, okay, Jezebel's going to kill me. What am I going to do to hide from her? I can't. And so just kill me now. And yet, an angel comes to him and says, no, eat. And then again, eat. And on that food, he goes 40 days. 40 days, a very long, tiresome journey to God's mountain, to Mount Horeb, the Mount of God. Horeb is, for those of you who've not studied Hebrew, Horeb is another interchangeable name with Sinai. They are used as one and the same, often in the same passage in other places. So this means this is Mount Sinai. This is back to where God showed his power to the nation of Israel. And so, then, this time, though, Elijah needs something different than the people needed. He's seen God's power just now. He knows God is powerful. We just saw it on Mount Carmel. And yet, what he needs is another reminder that God is not just powerful, but also gentle. God says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah replies, "I've been very jealous, and Israel has left you, and I alone am left, and they're ready to kill me. There's just no hope." He's hopeless. He has nothing left in his tank. And yet, God says, at first, before saying anything, he says, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. So wind, earthquake, and fire, very similar to thunder, earthquake, and lightning. Similar principles, slightly different causes and ends. But similar ideas, especially in ancient languages. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Which, by the way, he probably was already supposed to be doing that, which is interesting. That he seems to be trying to pull back from the Lord. He's lost his hope, and so he's not going all the way out to the Lord. He won't. And then he hears the whisper, and he comes out. And behold, there came a voice to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" So God asks it again, and he reminds him. He's reminding him that, yes, I care. There is a soft side to me as well. There's a reason to want to obey me. It isn't just about the fear. It's not just about my power. Because why would we care about being in the presence of God? Why would that matter to us? If God is just this incredible God that has this incredible power, that's only a root of love from fear. And while fear is important, there is no real relationship there. And so this is where God is trying to take his people. It's what God was trying to do in Exodus 19. He started with fear, remind them, yes, this is important, but then you shall be to me a treasured possession. There is a relationship that is intended to continue there. And then to finish Elijah's story, God then gives him a purpose that he tells him is going to work. He says, go anoint Hazael, then go anoint Jehu, and then go anoint Elisha as your successor. And the one who escapes Hazael, Jehu will get. The one who escapes Jehu, Elisha is going to get. And while we think of it like, Elisha will put to death by the sword, no, that's ridiculous. The idea is these people are accomplishing my purpose. It's going to work. I'm still here in power. And then he reminds him that there are 7,000 in Israel that have not worshipped Baal. And so he gives him point, yes, there's still a chance. I still care. I'm still here. And I still have power. So then, the important note I really want to get from this one, especially, is that it took effort to get there. Elijah is downbeaten. Elijah is hopeless. And yet, the food he receives from God, which he had to get from God in the first place, takes him 40 days and nights in order to get to the mountain of God. There's those steps that he had to take. He had to go there. He wasn't even strictly just told, you're going here. He's just on the run and he goes. But he still has to go to be with God, even though he almost doesn't want to be. But he does, and God pushes him to get there. And then that leads to Elijah being rejuvenated, being ready to go back at his job. So, it takes effort, but it's worth it. It is worth it to have that effort. And then as we go on in Israel's history, Isaiah and Micah are going to make that even more clear for us, that it is worth it, that there is a better purpose than just fear. Micah chapter 4 and Isaiah chapter 2. Very similar passages. You could turn to either one of them. I'll be turning to Micah 4. And when I say very similar passages, I actually mean identical. The prophecies are exactly identical, with the exception of Micah has one additional verse. So I'll be reading Micah chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. It shall come to pass in the latter days. The latter days is a sign of a messianic prophecy, something that is to come well beyond what the prophet can reasonably see. In the latter days, that the mountain of the house of the Lord, all right, referring to Jerusalem, shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and it shall be lifted up above the hills. And people shall flow to it, and many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and shall decide for strong nations far away. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war anymore. Nations are flowing to the house of God, to the mountain of the house of God. Why? Why are they going? Not because they're so afraid and they're being driven there, but because they want to learn. They want to learn the paths of God. They want to learn to walk in his ways. Because the law is coming from Zion. God's righteous judgment, which they are welcoming, is coming from this mountain. And then, because of God's judgment, the following is, there will be no more war. No more. They don't need swords anymore. They don't need spears. Instead, they're just farming tools. Nobody was ever afraid of a bunch of farmers. This was the problem that happens, here, I'm going to go on my history nerd. This is the problem that happens post-World War II in West Germany, East Germany. America and the other European nations say, well, you need to rebuild Germany. And Russia says, no, we need to tear them down, make sure they can never rise again. And the same goal is that we're never going to have another war, and yet different ideas. Russia's idea comes from the idea that farmers aren't very scary. They just wanted to make Germany a bunch of farming land. And the whole point is because farmers don't scare anybody. And so then, God says they're going to be farmers. Not because they're being forced to be that, but because there isn't a need for war. There is no reason, because God is the judge. And then the end, verse 5 of Micah, for all the peoples walk, each in the name of its God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. So they're going to the mount of the Lord. They want to go. And then in Isaiah chapter 25, we're going to see that, and yet another example of this, that God is providing a feast. This is a good thing. People want to be here. Isaiah chapter 25, and beginning in verse 6, in context with chapter 24, God has just stopped the physical feasting of the earth. The earth isn't feasting anymore. And yet in chapter 25, on this mountain, verse 6, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, of marrow, of aged wine, well refined. So for all peoples on this mountain, there will be a feast. But this one isn't an earthly feast. This isn't a feast that's going to come to an end that is often directly related to sin itself. This is a feast provided by God. This is one that people want to be at. Not because it's so much pleasurable because of sin, but because it's provided by the creator of the universe. And then, going on, verse 7, he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples. He's using the word all the time. And this is showing that it's for everybody. This is a stop to all earthly feasts to be replaced by this solution for all peoples. It's not just for Israel. The veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces. This is a place of happiness, this feast is. It doesn't end. There isn't, I know my cousin was at a wedding, and we were talking on the way here about how many weddings there are in the summer, but each of those is coming to an end. The wedding cannot last forever. And then you have to go back home, and you have to go back to regular life. And regular life is hard. It's not a wedding feast all the time. And yet, this is God giving us the opportunity to have a feast, an eternal, God-given feast where there is no more tears, there is no more, wait, did I forget something? There's nothing more to be had. This is the perfect place to be. And then, the important thing then to take from that is we need to be there. The hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain. If it's resting on this mountain then that means that's where he is, and that's where the feast will be. And so if you are outside this mountain, if you're at the foot of the mountain, you're not there. You're not at the feast. And so it becomes very important to go to the mountain of the Lord. But, of course, everything must have its New Testament connection because, of course, the Old Testament is no longer binding, and therefore the New Testament is what matters to us. And so, then, in this time between the Testaments, the Jews took these passages like this, passages like Isaiah chapter 9, as we study, that talk about it, and they go, well, this must mean a physical kingdom, a physical feast. And so they're waiting for this Messiah, and they're waiting for this coming one. And yet they've missed the point. Because you look in context and you see it, and when Jesus comes, he spends much of his time, a lot of his teaching is trying to correct this idea that it's an earthly kingdom. It's like, no, this isn't the point. The point is not about the earthly kingdom. Even in his own apostles, they don't get it right up until the very end. We see them asking in Acts chapter 1, Lord, at this time will you restore the kingdom? They still don't get it. And yet, the Jews take this and they run with it. But in one particular passage, Jesus makes it very clear what it's supposed to be, and he doesn't even do it to the Jews because the Jews aren't listening anymore. And so he tells it to the Samaritan woman. You may know where I'm going with this. The passage that we'll be turning to next is John chapter 4. This is our third usage of on this mountain. John chapter 4, Jesus is at the town of Sychar, which is on Mount Ebal. Ebal and Gerizim, as you will recall, are the mountains of blessings and curses. The reminder for Israel that if you obey me, there are all these great relationship things that I'm going to give you. You will be my treasured possession. And then also the curses, the reminder, if you don't, there is a fear. There is a real danger if you don't. It will be worse for you than all the other nations if you don't, because you should know. And so, on Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim, these places, particularly Mount Gerizim, had become very important to the Samaritans. And that's important to understanding this passage. That Mount Gerizim was the location of the temple that the Samaritans worshipped God at. They didn't worship in Jerusalem. And so that becomes very important to understanding what the question is that the woman has for Jesus once she starts to understand what's happening, right? We have in verse 16 through 18, we have the whole, call your husband, I don't have a husband, but you're right that you said no husband. And so then in 19, she picks up, the woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, Mount Gerizim, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. So, what she's asking him, what is a very legitimate question. You're a prophet, so you must know the answer. Where are we supposed to worship? It's supposed to be on Mount Jerusalem, or is it supposed to be on the Mount Gerizim? Where does it really matter? And Jesus' reply is neither of those things. Jesus' reply is, well, actually, it's changing. He says that it's neither this mountain, nor is it Jerusalem. He says, beginning in verse 21, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, it is now here. The hour is here. That's important later. When the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. You see, the old law wasn't enough. It's a physical worship. It's a physical place. Then you go, and it's the tabernacle, and then it's the temple in Jerusalem. That isn't a working solution because God is spirit. He's not physical. And we always understood this, and yet that means he cannot be worshipped in physical ways, right? You shall make no images, because there isn't an image to be made of God. He doesn't have a physical image that we can see. So then, if God is spirit, his throne must also be spiritual, which means his reigning place must be not physical. Mount Zion is not referring just to physical Jerusalem, although it is in part, of course. We see all sorts of allusions to Pentecost. Out of Zion shall go forth the law. That is where Christianity starts, is in Jerusalem. There's that first mountain for the prophet, but then beyond that, you can see yet another mountain, another reasoning for the prophecy. There is the spiritual Zion, the new Jerusalem that is coming. So, God's throne is spiritual, and the physical is just a shadow, or in Hebrews, where we're about to be going, it is a type. It is a type that is to be fulfilled. So, then, the woman, however, begins to figure this out. She starts to pick up on things like, and is now here. The hour is here. And she says, I know the Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. And Jesus replies, I who speak to you am he. Now, that ought to give you chills. Just that simple statement, that declaration of Jesus declaring that he is the Messiah, that he is the Christ. This is one of the clearest he ever gets with anybody that he is teaching. And it is given not to the Jews, because the Jews aren't listening because they're just looking for that physical mountain. So then, the lesson for us ought to be, number one, don't look for the physical mountain. The physical mountain isn't what matters anymore. It's not a physical place. It's a spiritual place, which means it's something that we all want to reach. We all should be able to reach, because that's what Christ came to do. We must worship in spirit and in truth. So, it's not about Jerusalem. It's not about the temple. It's not about the law. It is about worshiping God the way that he wants to be worshipped, because he is the creator. Therefore, he needs to be worshipped. If you create something, say you put together a model car, that model car ought to do what you want to do, right? This is the modern version of the potter and the clay. The clay does not tell the potter, why did you do me like this? This is ridiculous. No, the clay does what the potter wants it to do. And that's how it always has to work. So, then, if it's a spiritual mountain, then it is the mountain of God. The place of God's power and gentleness we see in Mount Sinai is a representation, then, of that type to be carried forward. Isaiah chapter 25, this is where salvation comes from. Salvation comes from God's mountain. Micah chapter 4, the law comes from God's mountain. Judgment, which we know from other passages to be righteous judgment, will come from God's law. And that brings peace, that brings happiness, that brings a feast, a place of pure joy, because it is provided by God. John chapter 4, and then combined with Revelation, Zion is the place that God reigns. And therefore, Mount Zion, come let us go to the mount, is the place that his people ought to go to worship him. Mount Zion, of course, the New Jerusalem is, through Revelation, we understand, in heaven. That is the symbolic being, place where it is, where God's throne reigns. And then, through that, then, the way we have to reach that, we are given by Jesus, by God, through great sacrifice, that Jesus is now our mediator, that Jesus helps us to be in between the two, in between us, an unholy people who are trying to become more holy, and a holy God who cannot be with us. Jesus becomes that stand-in, that in-between, to help us get to that mountain. Because one does not climb Mount Everest without a guide. One does not climb any mountain. You don't just go climb the mountain unless you're incredibly experienced with climbing mountains, and even then, still very risky, without having a guide. You have to know what it's going to be like. So, Jesus helps us climb that mountain. He helps us be there and helps us become holy in order to be with God. So, then, today, I have two takeaways for us. Number one, that we need to want to be with God. It takes a desire. It takes an effort then, because, number two, it's going to be hard sometimes. It is a mountain for a reason. It isn't a valley. You can fall into a valley by accident. You can't climb a mountain by accident. You don't just wake up and go, I think I'm going to climb Mount Everest today. That doesn't happen. It has to be intentional. It has to take effort and work. And you certainly don't wake up and just find yourself on Mount Everest. Jeremy DeHutt, who's well known here, recently through Appian Media put out the movie Out of Egypt. Some of you may have already seen it. In this movie, he and his crew, they land in Egypt, and they talk about the Nile, and then they leave out, and they go and they follow what is a more or less traditional route for the people of Israel going, and they go to the traditional site of Mount Sinai. They're very clear that's not, them saying this is the right site. That's simply they chose the traditional one for their purposes. And they go and they're going to climb this mountain. And for, legal reasons, they got started later than they wanted to. And it was hard. It was exhausting, partly because they were in a hurry. And they've got to go up that mountain, and it's hard. And they go up the mountain once. And then they spent the night up there. And yet they only went up once. And Jeremy talks about thinking about, first of all, how incredible it would be to go up this mountain when God is covering it in thunder and lightning and fire and the sound of a trumpet. God's presence is there. And yet Moses climbs this mountain. Joshua climbs part way. The elders of Israel have a meal with God, whatever that is intended to mean for us. They climb this mountain at least part way to be with God. And also, it was hard. It's not an easy climb to make, and yet Moses, an 80-year-old man, is doing it over and over and over and over again. He's going up and down this mountain. And it's a big mountain. And yet, yes, maybe he was blessed by God. He is blessed by God, we know, with extra physical strength. He doesn't seem to physically get old, and yet we also see him getting tired and weary. This is an exhausting project to go up and down this mountain to receive the law, and yet it's worth it because he's going up and down and he's getting the law. He's getting the tabernacle instructions for God to be at least closer to his people than they could be before. God is coming down to be with them, at least in part, so that they will learn to climb the mountain to be with him. So, number one, be intentional about going to be with God. Be sure. Know you're going to do it. Set times to go to God in prayer. Set times to read your Bible. Make it a habit. Make it routine. There are times to be spontaneous, right? There are times like Nehemiah to send what I've heard called arrow prayers, just simple lines. And there's also times to take half an hour or all night with God in prayer. Jesus, the Son of God, still needed to create that relationship with his Father. Go to him when you're struggling. Go to him when it's easy, when you're doing great. God is our Father, as we sang about last week, and as Brother Bill preached about 2 weeks ago. God is our Father, and that means he wants to be with us. He wants to hear from us. One thing I learned at SC that wasn't a surprise in the slightest, but I still had to actually learn it even though I've been told it, is that my relationship with my parents shouldn't at least, just mean that I call them when something's wrong or when I'm upset about something. It should also mean I call them and talk to them when things are going great, when I'm excited, because my father and my mother want to hear from me. It's a relationship. It goes two ways, both in good and in bad times. It's like we talked about in marriage class, that you don't just communicate when things are going badly, because that's a really bad way to communicate. And so then, why do we treat our Heavenly Father any differently? Why do we treat him like he's just something to go to when we have a problem, when we're upset? Go to him when you're happy. Go to him when you're excited. And go to him when you're in trouble. Both are important. He's there to help with both. He wants you to climb the mountain, to be with him, to speak to him. Where did Jesus go to pray all night long? Almost every time. Up on the mountain. He goes to the mountain to be with God, to be in solitude. Find a spiritual mountain. It doesn't have to be a mountain. We're in Illinois, after all. Or Indiana, I guess now. Whatever. Either way, there's no mountains here. There are not mountains. So, don't go climb a physical mountain because it's going to take you all day. Find a spiritual place for you to be with your Father. Be intentional about it. And then, with that effort, it's going to take effort, but it is worth it. Hebrews chapter 12, and this is where we will end for this morning. Hebrews chapter 12, The Hebrew writer's gone through this whole section. Jesus is better than this. Jesus is better than this. Jesus is better than this. And he gets to chapter 12, and he begins with Jesus is the founder, the perfecter of our faith. Jesus is there, and then he goes on. He says, I'm not going to take the time to read 3 through 17, but he says, essentially, don't grow weary. Keep going. It's hard, but it's worth it to keep going. Why is it worth it? We'll begin in verse 18. For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness, and gloom and a tempest, the sound of a trumpet, and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given, if even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. They couldn't even endure not being with God. There was this barrier, and they couldn't deal with that. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. God judges, and the righteous become holy, they become perfect, and therefore are with God in this new the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. It's better. It's better. This is better. It's not a place of just of fear anymore. This is the place where you come when you're ready to be with God. You have done what he asks of you to become holy, to be like him. And so, you've come to Zion, a place of joy, a feast for all peoples, and not a place of fear. God chooses all peoples to be his children. He's chosen them to be his family, and he wants them to be with him on his mountain for eternity. So, verse 25, see that you do not refuse him who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, the Israelites, plenty of warnings, they refused to go into the land. They did not escape. They all died in the wilderness. How much less will we escape if we reject him who warns us from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. He's going to shake more. There is still this element of fear. He's going to shake everything. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken. That is, things that have been made in order that the things that cannot be shaken, a kingdom that cannot be shaken, a kingdom that will not pass away, may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful. Let us be happy for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, Leviticus 10, for our God is a consuming fire. Do not refuse the God, the creator of heaven and earth, because he is a consuming fire. Those who try to come before him and are not holy, do not treat him as holy, and therefore are not holy themselves, will be consumed by fire, the second death. One of my professors at FC said this about God being just and loving and being able to both bless people with heaven and condemn. He said, God gives everyone what they want. If in life they show a desire, they show the effort, the work for him to be with them, to climb his mountain, those are my words I'm adding, then he grants them that for eternity. They get to be with him in heaven on his mountain. If not, if they show no desire to be with him at all, for him to be with them, and by the way, desire, true desire means actions, it means doing what he wants, what he says, then he gives them that also. And that is letting them choose to be without him for eternity, because that is what hell is, the absence of God. There is a fear there. I don't want to be absent of God, because even as far as I might feel as God is from me on this physical earth, he's still here. He's still blessing me with everything that I do have. So to be without him means to be without anything at all. To be with him means to have everything, to be perfect, to have a feast, to innumerable angels in festal gathering. Think about that. So many angels, you can't think about them, and they're essentially just having a party. Not a party as we think of it, but they are praising God, which is what they want to be doing. That's what we ought to want to be doing. And so then, make sure today, make sure this morning that you are climbing that mountain, that you are trying to be with God. It takes effort. If you're not putting effort in, then you're not doing enough. Excel still more, Paul says. That means if you've just started being a Christian, excel still more. Climb harder. If you've been a Christian your entire life, you're up there, you're in your 50s, your 60s, climb, excel still more. Just keep going. You never reach this top until you get to heaven. It is a never-ending climb that Jesus is there to help you be with, and you're going to fall sometimes. So, today, make sure you're climbing that mountain. If there is something we can help you to do with that, to start that climb, to stop taking your stand at the foot and to start climbing, or if you've started to fall, help us pick you up. We're here to be your fellow mountain climbers. If we could do anything to help you with that this morning, please come forward as we stand and sing the song of invitation.
Come with them, all the Lord, and let our joys be known. Join in a song with sweet accord. Join in a song with sweet accord. And thus around the throne, and thus around the throne. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, Zion, the beautiful city of God. Let those we used to sing who never knew our God. The children of the heavenly King, the children of the heavenly King, may speak their joys abroad, may speak their joys abroad. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, Zion, the beautiful city of God. Then let our souls abound and every tear be dry. We're marching to Emmanuel's throne. We're marching to Emmanuel's throne. To fairer worlds on high, to fairer worlds on high. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, Zion, the beautiful city of God.
Thank you, David, for an excellent lesson. And I like the application that you made at the end. I really appreciate it. So good job for David. We can see the growth that he's made since he's been away at college. And I believe he's kind of determined that he wants to be a preacher, don't you? Kind of mentioned that. So I wish him luck in that. And I'm sure he'll do a great job. Our closing hymn is Singing Redemption Song. After the song, we'll have a closing prayer.
Angels are singing redemption, sweet song, wonderful theme, glorious theme. Shout the glad message and join in the throng, singing redemption song. Sing the sweet story, redemption, sweet song. Over and over, the chorus prolong. Shout the glad
Holy God, our Father in heaven, we want to take this opportunity, Father, to praise your great and matchless name. We offer prayers, Heavenly Father, thanking you for blessings that we have received, seeking, Father, your help and your blessings upon us. Oftentimes, Father, we fail to just praise you. And we're here, Father, to worship and praise you this morning. And so